So far, we've seen how Playwright allows you to open up a new, configure that browser for your tests. Now let's look at the next layer down. See, the way Playwright works is that you don't have an individual test associated just with a browser. You have this thing called browser context. A browser context is a little bit like a session, an isolated context for your test to run inside a browser. So with Playwright, you will open up a browser and then you'll have multiple contexts for each of your tests. And this is incredibly powerful because it allows your test to be very, very efficient. And this for three reasons. It allows you to isolate your tests from each other so that they can run in complete isolation. They don't step on each other's toes. They don't share history or cookies or session data. So the tests tend to be a lot more reliable in that sense. This is a lot more efficient than more conventional approaches such as Selenium and Cypress, where in Selenium, for example, if you're running 4 tests in parallel, you need to open 4 browsers on your machine, and that consumes a lot more resources. Cypress doesn't support parallel execution on a single machine, so that's not really a question. But for resource usage, contexts are a much more effective way of managing your machine resources when you're running multiple tests. And browser contexts are also a great way to manage multiple user sessions. So suppose you have a scenario where you've got an administrator doing something and a normal user doing something else in the same test. You can do that with multiple browser contexts in the same test. The concept of a browser context is relatively simple. Inside a given browser that Playwright will open, you can have multiple browser contexts. Each browser context is a little bit like an incognito session in a browser, if you like. Each context is separate from the other context, even though they are running on the same physical browser, which means that it's much more efficient in terms of memory storage. Each browser context has its own set of cookies, its own local storage that you can use to set up your tests. And this gives you a lot of separation, a very clean separation between your tests. But it also has some interesting features that we'll see later on in the course when you can take data that you prepare in one context and use it to create a brand new context. For example, if you log on using a logon screen, you get the session state and the cookies related to that authentication in one context. You can extract that data and use it to create a new context so that in your new context, in your new test, you don't need to log on again. You already have that information, but they are still 2 different contexts. Browser contexts give us a lot of flexibility in how we organize our tests. Typically, each test will have its own browser context. This is the most basic, the most fundamental way of using Playwright. You do not want to create a new browser for each test in Playwright. You don't want to launch a new browser for each test. That's inefficient. You want to launch one browser and use a context per test. Or depending on your scenario, you may want more than one context for the same test. If you've got 2 users interacting in different browsers in the real world, you could simulate that by having 2 browser contexts in the same test, and user A is in one context, user B is in another context, and they can interact. Browser contexts also make it much easier to run things in parallel. So Playwright has really good support for parallel execution out of the box, which makes it very easy to run several tests in parallel in different contexts in the same browser. So browser contexts are pretty easy to understand at a conceptual level, but let's now dive in and have a look at how they actually work when you manipulate the Playwright. Let's have a look at the code we saw earlier in our previous lesson and use it to try and understand how browser contexts work in practice. I'm going to reactivate the non-headless mode and run these tests. Now watch carefully what happens. Note we have 2 tests, one that checks the title and one that does a simple search. So there we have the one opening and the two openings. So you notice how we opened two separate browsers to run those tests. If we were running them in parallel, it would be the same thing. We'd open two separate browsers. The reason we open two separate browsers is that before each test, I'm calling browser new page. Now, the new page method will automatically create a new browser context behind the scenes. So we're getting a new browser context for each of our tests, which is not optimal in terms of isolation. So look in terms, just note that this took roughly 6 seconds to run. So now what we're going to do is we're going to refactor this code so that it can share a browser context between all of the tests that get executed in this test case. To do that, I'm going to need to share these variables across the tests. And the way I need to do that is I'm going to make them static. So I'll make them private just to emphasize we don't want to share these anywhere. So I want the Playwright instance to be private and the browser to be private. And what I'm also going to do is add a browser context and make that static as well. So the browser context will be shared across all of the tests. Now what I need to do is change this setup so that it actually runs before all of the tests, and it's going to need to be static now. So I want a static method that will set up the browser. And what's that going to do? It's going to instantiate the Playwright instance and the browser instance just like we did before, but rather than instantiating the page, what I want to do is create a browser context. So I create a new browser context before any tests run. And I am still going to need a before method for each. Let's make that public. So we can set up the page itself. And here I will need to say something like page browser context, new page. Let's get rid of that. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting up the browser, creating the browser, and creating a new browser context, which will apply across all of the tests. And then for each test, I create open a new page. And this after each will now become after all, needs to be static. So we can shut things down afterwards. So now let's run this test. And remember, it was a little over 6 seconds last time. Let's watch how many browser instances we open. So that flashed through was actually opening in the same browser. And look at the time. Rather than 6 seconds, it only took 1 second, 1.5 seconds. So that is to show you just how much more efficient using browser context correctly can be.